The black stallion bit her at 7 in the morning. And she knew immediately this was the most intelligent animal she had ever met. He aimed for the exact spot on her shoulder that would hurt the worst without killing her. 3 men were already in the hospital. A broken collarbone, cracked ribs, a bruise the color of a rotting plum. Her father had forbidden anyone from entering that corral. Beatrice Gardner climbed the fence at dawn anyway. She didn't run when he charged. She sat down in the dirt, pressed her hand against the bleeding wound, and started humming a hymn her dead mother used to sing. And for the first time in 3 days, the horse stood still. But here's the thing no one knew. The new cowboy who rode in that afternoon. The one with the gentle hands and the quiet voice. The horse didn't fight him. The horse cowered, backed into the corner, trembled. Because this man and this stallion shared a history, and carved into the horse's shoulder, hidden beneath his mane, was a scar in the shape of a letter, cut not with an iron, but with a heated knife. The cowboy who came to save this horse was the same man who once held the rope while it screamed. Welcome to Cowboy Dusk channel, where the last light reveals the truest stories. This channel is your refuge for tales of redemption, wild hearts, and love forged under western skies. If the frontier speaks to your soul, you've found your place. This story teaches us that some things can't be broken, not because they never crack, but because someone is patient enough to mend them. And that the hardest journey isn't running away, it's turning around and walking back. If that opening hooked you, wait until you hear what Beatrice finds hidden in his saddlebag, and what happens inside a burning barn at 3 in the morning. Stay till the very last word. And if this kind of storytelling sets your heart on fire, smash that like button. Tell me in the comments which moment gave you chills. Share this with someone who needs it tonight. And subscribe to Cowboy Dusk so you never miss a story. Now, let's begin.
Rebecca Forsyth did not believe in omens. But that morning, when the old mare refused to cross the gate for the 3rd time, pawing at the dirt and tossing her head like something invisible stood in the way, maybe she should have listened. She clicked her tongue and gave the reins a firm shake. The mare snorted, ears pinned flat, and finally lurched forward with the reluctance of a creature that knew better than its rider. The wagon rattled over the ruts in the hard, packed road, and Rebecca settled onto the bench seat, adjusting her bonnet against the already punishing California sun. It was Saturday, Supply Day. The ride from the Forsyth homestead into San Bernardino took the better part of an hour, and she made it alone because there was no one else to make it with her. Her father Robert's hands shook too much to handle the reins on rough road, though he would sooner cut out his own tongue than admit it. Her brother Thomas was 300 miles north in San Francisco, learning to argue for a living, and her mother was 3 years in the ground, buried beside the creek where the wild roses grew. So Rebecca went alone. She always went alone. She had her leather notebook in her lap, her supply list written in neat, careful letters, and her mother's old derringer tucked into the pocket of her dress, where it pressed cold against her thigh. A woman did not travel 5 miles of open road in 1878 California without protection. Not if she had any sense. The road curved past the Miller homestead, and Rebecca kept her eyes forward. She tried to, anyway. But the silence of the place pulled at her the way silence always does when it used to be full of sound. The Miller family had left 2 months ago, sold out to Pacific Land and Rail for pennies on the dollar after their fences were cut 3 times and their well turned up poisoned. The house still stood, white paint peeling, a child's swing hanging from the big oak tree in the yard. It rocked in the breeze, slow and steady, pushed by a wind that had no one left to push it for. Rebecca looked away, opened her notebook, checked her list. Flour, salt, coffee, fabric for new curtains, medicine for her father's knee. She wrote the word knee and underlined it, though they both knew his knee was not the problem. The problem was his heart, the way he sat down too quickly when he thought she was not watching, The way his breath came short after climbing the porch steps, the way his face went gray on bad days. She would not think about that now. She had a list to complete. San Bernardino spread out below her as the road crested the last rise. It was a town caught between two worlds. The old adobes and wooden storefronts of the ranching families sat alongside newer brick buildings funded by railroad money. The Southern Pacific had reached town 2 years ago, and with it came men in Eastern suits who looked at the land the way a butcher looks at a side of beef, calculating what each piece was worth and how best to carve it up. Men like Elijah Crow. Rebecca tied the mare to the post outside the general store and went inside. The store smelled of leather and tobacco and the faintly sweet rot of overripe fruit in the barrel by the door. She handed her list to Mr. Hutchins behind the counter and waited while he gathered her order. While she waited, she ran her fingers along a bolt of blue calico on the display table. Her mother would have liked this fabric, would have made curtains from it, maybe a new dress for Sunday meeting. Rebecca traced the pattern of tiny white flowers and felt the familiar ache settle behind her ribs, like an old bruise that never quite healed. Voices drifted from the back of the store. 2 men near the ammunition shelf, talking low but not low enough. Crow is looking at the land northwest of town now. Forsyth spread. Rebecca's hand stilled on the fabric. She did not turn around, did not move. She stood perfectly still and listened with every nerve in her body while her heart hammered against her ribs. Heard the old man's behind on payments. Crow bought the note from the bank 6 months back. Just been squeezing slow. You know how he does it. Figured the daughter would break first. She's been running that place near on her own since the mother passed. Rebecca memorized the voices, filed them away in the part of her mind that kept track of threats and debts and the slow erosion of everything her family had built. Then she picked up her packages, thanked Mr. Hutchins, and walked out into the blinding Saturday sun. The street was busy, wagons and horses and people moving between the saloons and shops. A group of vaqueros rode past, their silver spurs catching the light. The smell of dust and horse sweat and cooking meat hung in the hot, still air. Then she heard the commotion. It started with shouting, a man's voice, rough and slurred with whiskey, rising above the normal noise of the street like a match struck in a dark room. Rebecca turned toward the sound. A drunk stood in the middle of the street, rough-looking, unshaven, wearing range clothes that had not seen a washtub in weeks. He had his hand on his gun, and he was pointing it at an older man who stood 10 feet away with his palms raised and his face the color of old tallow. "I told you what would happen if you did not pay," the drunk said. His name was Virgil, though Rebecca did not know that then and would not learn it until later. His gun hand was unsteady, but his eyes were mean and focused. "You had your chance. Now you get what is coming." The older man was backing up, stumbling over his own feet. His voice cracked with desperation. "I will have it next week, I swear. 1 more week. Please." And between them, standing frozen in the middle of the street like a fence post driven into the packed dirt, was a boy. 8 years old, maybe 9. Brown hair, bare feet, wearing a shirt 2 sizes too big that hung off his thin shoulders. He had been crossing the street when the argument erupted, and now he stood paralyzed, directly in the line of fire, his eyes wide and glassy with terror. The crowd was pulling back. Men stepped into doorways. Women gathered their children. Everyone moved away from the danger. No one moved toward the boy. Rebecca's packages hit the boardwalk. The brown paper split, and the bolt of blue calico rolled into the dust. She did not notice. She did not think. Her body moved before her mind gave it permission. The way a hand jerks back from a hot stove, faster than thought, faster than reason. She ran. The distance between the boardwalk and the boy was maybe 20 feet. She covered it in seconds, her boots pounding the packed dirt, her dark hair coming loose from its pins. She reached the boy and shoved him hard with both hands, sending him stumbling toward the safety of the boardwalk where a woman caught him and pulled him close. Rebecca turned back, and that was when she saw the second man. He was not Virgil. He was standing in the mouth of the alley between the saloon and the feed store, half in shadow, and there was a knife in his hand. But the man with the knife was not looking at Rebecca. His eyes were fixed on something across the street, past her, over her shoulder. Someone on the opposite boardwalk. She saw the blade move, saw the flash of steel in the afternoon sun, and then white fire exploded through her body, so sudden and so complete that for a moment she thought she had been shot. The knife caught her below the ribs on her left side, and the pain was a living thing, a scream that started in her flesh and went all the way to the marrow of her bones. She gasped, stumbled. Her hands went to her side and came away red. In the space between the blade going in and her knees hitting the ground, she heard something. A whisper close to her ear, spoken in a voice that was already moving away, already vanishing. Words that her conscious mind would not hold on to, that would sink below the surface of her memory like a stone dropped in dark water. "This is for you, Caldwell." Then she was falling. The dirt rushed up to meet her. Dust filled her mouth. The sun was a white blaze above her, merciless and indifferent. Blood soaked through her cotton dress in a spreading stain that was almost black in the harsh light. Across the street, Hayes Caldwell stood on the boardwalk and watched his past catch up with him. He had seen the knife. He had seen the face. Jack Curtis. 7 years of running, 3 states, a dozen towns, sleeping with one eye open and never staying anywhere long enough for the ground to remember his boot prints. And Curtis had found him anyway. The girl had run between them. Curtis had been moving toward Hayes, knife in hand, using the confusion of Virgil's gun display as cover. The girl with the dark hair and the blue calico had run right through the space between hunter and prey, and now she was bleeding in the street for a sin she did not even know existed. Hayes had a choice: chase Curtis into the alley and finish this, or save the girl. He looked at the alley where Curtis had already vanished, swallowed by shadow. He looked at the girl on the ground, blood pooling beneath her, dust on her face, her eyes going glassy. There was no choice at all. There never had been. He crossed the street in 4 strides, dropped to his knees beside her, pulled his vest off and wadded it against the wound, pressing hard. She cried out, a thin sound like a bird with a broken wing, and her eyes found his face. She was young, 22, maybe 23. Dark hair tangled with dust. Brown eyes that should have been full of pain but instead held something else entirely. Something that hit Hayes like a fist to the chest. "The boy," she whispered. Her voice was barely a thread. "Is the boy all right?" She was bleeding out in the street and she was asking about the child. Hayes swallowed something that felt like ground glass. "The boy is fine," he said. "You saved him. Now hold still." He lifted her. She was lighter than he expected, or maybe the urgency made her seem so. Her head fell against his shoulder and he felt her blood soak through his shirt, warm and wet, a sensation he knew too well from a lifetime he had tried to leave behind. As he carried her toward the hotel, Hayes looked back at the alley where Curtis had vanished. The man had not come here for this girl. He had come here for Hayes. And now she was bleeding for sins she knew nothing about. The question was no longer whether Curtis would come back. It was what Hayes would have left to lose when he did. The last time Hayes Caldwell held a suture needle over living flesh, his patient died. He had sworn he would never do it again. Swearing, it turned out, meant nothing when a woman was bleeding through a hotel mattress. Mattie Henderson's hotel was the only respectable establishment in San Bernardino, and Mattie herself was the kind of woman who could organize a cavalry charge with one hand while frosting a cake with the other. She had the upstairs room ready before Hayes reached the top of the stairs. Sheets pulled back, water boiling on the small stove in the corner, clean cloth stacked on the nightstand. "Lay her down easy," Mattie said, and her voice carried the no-nonsense tone of a woman who had buried a husband, survived a cholera outbreak, and run a business alone for 8 years. She had earned that tone. Hayes set Rebecca on the bed as gently as he could manage, but the movement drew a moan from deep in her throat that made his stomach clench. Her face was the color of candle wax. Her dress was soaked through from the ribs to the hip. "I sent a boy for Doc Patterson," Mattie said, wringing out a cloth in the basin. "He is out at the Davis Ranch. Could be 2 hours or more." Hayes looked at the wound. looked at the blood. 2 hours was a long time, maybe too long. She does not have 2 hours, he said. Matty looked at him, looked at the blood, looked back at him. You know what you're doing? I used to. Used to will have to be good enough. What do you need? He told her. Hot water, clean cloth, whiskey, the strongest she had, a leather strap, thread and needle, silk if she had it, cotton if she did not. Matty moved like a woman half her age, gathering supplies with the efficient grace of someone who understood that speed and care were not opposites. When she left the room, Hayes rolled up his sleeves to the elbow. The scars on his forearms caught the lamplight, old white lines from cuts and burns earned in field hospitals that smelled of gangrene and gunpowder. He opened the saddlebag he had carried up with him and took out the surgical kit. It was a leather roll, worn soft with age, and inside it held instruments he had not used in 7 years. Forceps, scissors, suture needles, a scalpel with a mother-of-pearl handle that his commanding officer had given him on the day the war ended. Keep it, the officer had said. You have earned it. Hayes had kept it. He had also kept the nightmares that came with it, but the officer had not mentioned those. He laid the instruments on the cloth Matty had left, selected the suture needle, threaded it with steady hands, except his hands were not steady. The tremor started in his right hand and spread to his left. Not a little shake, not the minor unsteadiness of fatigue. This was a full-body memory rising up through his bones like groundwater after rain. His fingers jumped and twitched. The needle bobbed between them like a live thing trying to escape. In his mind, he saw another room, another patient, a boy with yellow hair and gray uniform soaked red, looking up at him with eyes that were already losing their light. Tell Jack I was not scared. And then the blood, pulsing between Hayes's fingers in a rhythm he could not stop, could not slow, could not do anything about because his hands would not stop shaking. He gripped the edge of the nightstand until his knuckles went white. Rebecca opened her eyes. She was pale, sweating, her breath coming in shallow, ragged gasps. The pain was a vast, dark thing pressing in from all sides. But through the fog, through the fear, she saw his hands. She saw the tremor. And instead of pulling away, instead of calling for someone else, instead of fear, she reached out from the bed and wrapped her fingers around his wrist. Not for comfort, not to be held. She gripped him the way you grip a rope in a storm, firm and deliberate. I trust you, she said. Her voice was barely there, a breath shaped into words. His hands went still. He looked at her fingers on his wrist, looked at her face. Her eyes were clear despite the pain, steady and certain. And in them he saw something he had not seen directed at him in a very long time. Faith, not the religious kind, the human kind, the kind that says, I do not know you, but I know enough. Hayes Caldwell picked up the suture needle and his hands did not shake. He cut away the fabric around the wound with his scalpel, careful, clinical, preserving her modesty as much as possible while exposing the injury. The blade had gone in clean, at an angle, slicing through skin and the muscle beneath, deep enough to bleed badly, not deep enough to reach the organs. Whoever had held that knife had either been remarkably precise or remarkably lucky, or perhaps his hand had faltered at the last moment, though Hayes could not imagine why. It needs cleaning and stitching, he said. No laudanum. There is no laudanum. This is going to be the worst pain you have felt in your life, and I am sorry for that. Rebecca nodded. Matty returned with the supplies. She handed the leather strap to Rebecca without being asked, and Rebecca bit down on it, her jaw clenching so hard the muscles in her neck stood out like cords. Hayes poured whiskey into the wound. Rebecca's back arched off the bed. Her scream was muffled by the leather strap. But it filled the room anyway, filled it the way water fills a sinking boat, everywhere at once. Her fingers dug into the mattress. Tears streamed from the corners of her eyes into her hair, running down her temples in twin silver lines. Breathe, Hayes said. Breathe, Hayes. His voice was calm, steady. The voice he used to use in the field hospital when men twice his size wept on his table. In through the nose, out through the mouth. Focus on my voice. The needle went in. She squeezed his hand. He had not realized she'd taken it again, but there it was, her fingers threaded through his, gripping so hard that his knuckles ground together. She did not scream again. She bit the leather and she held his hand, and she breathed the way he told her to, in through the nose, out through the mouth, and the tears ran silent and steady into her hair. 12 stitches. He placed each one with care, spacing them evenly, pulling the edges of the wound together with the precision of a man building something rather than repairing it. His hands were steady, rock steady, as if the tremor had never existed. When it was done, he tied off the thread and cut it, laid a clean cloth bandage over the wound and wrapped it around her middle, snug but not tight. His hands were gentle as he adjusted her torn dress back over her, covering her. He sat back, looked at the stitches, 12 clean lines in a neat row. "You are braver than most," he said. What he thought was something different. Braver than me. Braver than I have been in 7 years. He stood and crossed to the wash basin, plunged his hands into the water and watched it turn from clear to red to pink, the blood dissolving in slow, swirling clouds like sunset in a glass. He gripped the edge of the basin and closed his eyes, and behind his eyelids he saw Billy Curtis on the table, 16 years old, blonde hair dark with sweat, saying, "Tell Jack I was not scared," while his blood pulsed out between Hayes's shaking fingers. Hayes opened his eyes. The water was pink. His hands were clean. The girl behind him was alive. Mattie Henderson appeared in the doorway. She had been standing there for some time, arms crossed, watching with the sharp eyes of a woman who made her living reading people. "You know the man who did this to her," she said. It was not a question. Hayes did not answer. He dried his hands on the towel and did not turn around and did not answer. That night, when the town had gone quiet, and the only sound was Rebecca's labored breathing and the distant tinkling of a piano from the saloon down the street, Hayes checked his revolver for the 3rd time. He positioned his chair not beside the bed, where a doctor would sit to watch a patient, but in front of the door, facing it, his hand on his thigh, near his gun. Rebecca woke at midnight. Through the fog of pain and the after-effects of a half-glass of whiskey that Mattie had brought her, she saw his silhouette, rigid in the chair, back to her, facing the door. His shoulders were set in a line she recognized from watching her father when coyotes came too close to the livestock. Not the posture of a man keeping a medical vigil, the posture of a man keeping watch. Rebecca Forsyth, who had spent 3 years learning to read the silence between what people said and what they meant, who cataloged every detail in the leather notebook of her mind, filed this observation away, carefully, completely, the way she filed everything. Then she closed her eyes, and despite the pain, despite the stranger guarding her door, despite the questions already forming in the back of her mind like clouds gathering before a storm, she slept. There were 2 kinds of people who ended up in San Bernardino, those looking for something and those running from something. Rebecca was beginning to wonder which kind Hayes Caldwell was. She was also beginning to wonder which kind she was herself. 3 days had passed since the stabbing. Rebecca could sit up now without the room spinning. She could eat broth and the occasional piece of bread, though anything heavier made her stomach rebel. She could argue with Mattie Henderson about when she would be fit to leave, which she did with increasing frequency and decreasing patience. "Mattie, I have a farm to run. My father is alone out there. Your father survived 60 years on this earth before you started running his life, dear. He will manage a few more days." Rebecca opened her mouth to argue, and then closed it because Mattie was right, and they both knew it. The problem with Mattie Henderson was that she was almost always right. It was exhausting. Hayes tended her wound twice a day, morning and evening, with the clinical precision of a man performing a duty rather than an act of care. He changed the bandages without meeting her eyes, answered her questions in as few words as possible. The warmth she had glimpsed during the surgery, the gravel and honey voice that had talked her through 12 stitches, was gone. In its place was a wall of politeness so thick she could have plastered it. Rebecca noticed. Of course she did. She noticed everything. It was both her greatest strength and the thing that kept her up at nights. She noticed that Hayes never removed his gun belt, not even when he slept in the chair. She noticed that he left the room every time someone knocked on the door, checking the hallway before allowing anyone in. She noticed that he slept facing the door, never the window, and that he woke at the slightest sound, his hand going to his hip before his eyes were fully open. She opened her notebook and wrote in her neat, careful hand, H.C. Skilled, evasive, sleeps in chair, never removes gun belt. Why? The notebook was a habit she had developed after her mother died. Lists, schedules, accounts, weather patterns, planting dates. Everything written down, everything tracked. It was how she maintained control over a life that had proven in the space of one fever and one funeral that it could spin apart without warning. If she wrote it down, if she tracked it, if she cataloged every variable and planned for every contingency, then nothing could blindside her again. That was the theory anyway. The knife in her side suggested the theory had some holes in it. Robert Forsythe arrived on the second day. He rode into town on his sorrel gelding, hat pulled low against the sun, and when he walked into the hotel room and saw his daughter propped up in bed with bandages wrapped around her middle, something in his weathered face crumpled like paper thrown in a fire. He crossed the room in 2 strides and held her. Carefully, mindful of the wound but tightly, his calloused hands gripping her shoulders as if she might disappear if he let go. I could have lost you, he said. His voice was rough, the way sandstone is rough, worn down by years of wind and silence. But you did not. I am right here, Pa. When he pulled back, she saw that his eyes were dry. Robert Forsythe did not cry. He had not cried at his wife's funeral. He had not cried when Thomas left for San Francisco. He processed grief the way bedrock processes rain. It went through him and came out the other side, invisible but there, shaping the stone. But she noticed something else, too. He was thinner than when she had left the ranch 5 days ago. His color was bad, a grayish undertone beneath the weathered tan that she did not like at all. His hands trembled slightly when he released her, and when he sat down in the chair Hayes had vacated, he sat down hard, the way a man sits when standing has become an effort. She added this to the notebook in her mind. Father. Thinner. Gray. Hands shaking. Not the knee. Robert had brought paperwork. While Rebecca rested, he sat with Mattie in the hallway, and they spoke in low voices that they thought she could not hear. Rebecca could hear just fine. Her body was wounded, but her ears worked perfectly. $800, Robert said. The bank has given us 3 months. But it is not really the bank anymore. Fellow named Crow bought the note 6 months back. He has been shortening the deadlines, raising the interest, squeezing. Elijah Crow? Mattie's voice carried the particular edge it got when she was angry and trying not to show it. That snake has been buying up notes all over the valley. The Miller family, the Dawsons, the Petersons out by the pass. He buys the debt, and then he chokes until they sell. I know what he is doing, Robert said, but knowing and stopping are 2 different animals. Hayes Caldwell was coming up the stairs from the livery stable when he heard this conversation. He stopped on the landing, leaned against the wall. $800, the name Crow. He filed this information the way a soldier files the position of enemy artillery. Carefully, precisely, because your life might depend on remembering it later. Later that afternoon, Hayes approached Robert in the hotel parlor. Rebecca could hear them through the open door of her room, and she listened with the focused attention of a woman who had learned that the most important conversations happened when people thought she was not paying attention. Mr. Forsythe, I would like to offer my services. I can escort your daughter home when she is fit to travel, and I am looking for steady work. I am good with fences, livestock, irrigation. I can do carpentry if needed. I do not drink to excess, and I do not cause trouble. Robert studied him. Robert Forsythe was not a man who made quick decisions about people. He measured them the way he measured fence posts, by eye and by instinct, looking for straightness and strength. You were a doctor during the war, a surgeon, field hospital. But that was a long time ago. Skills like that do not go away. No, sir, they do not. Robert was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Why San Bernardino? A man with medical training could work anywhere." "City hospital, private practice." "Private. What brings you to a dirt town in the middle of California looking for cowboy work?" Hayes did not answer right away. When he did, his voice was careful. "I have been moving around for a while, looking for a place that feels right. I would like to stop moving if the right place would have me." Rebecca, listening from the bed, heard something in his voice that the words themselves did not contain. A hunger, not for food or money or comfort, for something deeper. When Hayes talked about the land, about irrigation and crop rotation, and the particular quality of soil in the San Bernardino Valley, his voice changed. It came alive in a way that it did not when he talked about anything else. His words quickened. His sentences grew longer. This was not a man who wanted to wander. This was a man who had lost his place and forgotten how to look for another one. Or maybe not forgotten. Maybe he had just stopped believing he deserved one. Robert nodded slowly. "We can talk terms on the ride home. Room and board and a fair wage, the work is hard and the hours are long, and I will expect you to earn your keep." "Yes, sir." They shook hands. Rebecca closed her eyes and pretended to be asleep when Robert came back to check on her. Hayes had his own reasons for wanting to stay close to the Forsyth homestead, and none of them were as simple as needing work. Jack Curtis was in San Bernardino, or near it. Curtis had tracked Hayes across 3 states in 7 years of running, and now he was here, and Rebecca Forsyth was a target because of it. If Hayes left, Curtis might still come for the girl, use her as bait to draw Hayes back. If Hayes stayed close, he could protect her. It was a calculation wrapped in good intentions, and he hated himself for it. But he had spent 13 years hating himself for one thing or another, and one more item on the list barely registered anymore. That afternoon, Sheriff Tom Barker arrived at the hotel to take Rebecca's statement about the stabbing. He was a big man running to softness around the middle with a star on his chest that looked like it had been polished recently and eyes that had not. There was something uneasy about him, a restlessness that went beyond the normal discomfort of a lawman doing routine work. Hayes left the room the moment Barker walked in, did not explain, did not excuse himself, simply slipped out the back door like smoke through a crack, and by the time Rebecca turned to look for him, he was gone. She noticed, added it to the notebook. Barker asked his questions. Did she see the attacker? No, not clearly. Could she describe him? Tall, thin, dark hat. Did she hear him say anything? Rebecca paused. In the depths of her memory, something stirred. A whisper. Words spoken close to her ear in the moment between the blade going in and her body hitting the ground. But the words were formless, shapeless, a sound without meaning, like trying to remember a dream after waking. "No," she said. "I did not hear anything, but that was not entirely true. She had heard something. She just could not remember what. And the fact that she could not remember bothered her more than the wound in her side. There was something else she did not tell the sheriff. When the knife went in, the attacker had not been looking at her. His eyes had been focused on someone behind her, across the street. Someone on the opposite boardwalk. She kept this to herself, filed it away. Barker finished his questions and stood to leave. In the hallway, he passed Robert Forsyth coming the other direction. Robert stopped. "Tom," he said. Just the name. Barker stiffened, almost imperceptibly, like a horse catching a scent it does not like. He and Robert had known each other for a long time. They had staked claims side by side back in '52 when the valley was still wild and the Mormons were building their settlement, and the land was open and full of promise. They had been friends once, good friends, the kind of friends who helped each other raise barns and bury wives and survive the hard years. Something had broken between them. Rebecca did not know what, but she could see the fracture in the way Barker could not meet her father's eyes. Robert offered him coffee. Barker declined. Left quickly, his boots heavy on the stairs, his shoulders hunched like a man carrying a weight he could not set down. The morning they left for the homestead was clear and hot. Hayes drove the wagon while Robert rode alongside on his sorrel. Rebecca lay in the back, cushioned by blankets, her notebook on her lap, her pen in her hand, cataloging everything. The temperature, the condition of the road, the way Hayes held the reins, loose and easy in his left hand, his right hand resting on his thigh near the butt of his revolver. As the wagon passed the last building on Main Street, Rebecca looked back. She could not have said why. Something made her turn. Some instinct older than reason, some animal awareness that she was being watched. On the saloon porch at the far end of town, a man stood in the shade, smoking, his hat pulled low over his face. She could not make out his features, but she could feel his eyes on her like the heat of a branding iron held close but not quite touching the skin. She was certain, with a cold clarity that had nothing to do with fever, that he was watching the wagon, watching where it went, and she was certain she would see him again. Hayes Caldwell had slept under 10,000 different skies in 7 years. Not one had made him want to look up twice. Then he saw the sky above the Forsyth homestead, wide and honest, and streaked with the kind of pink that made a man think about permanence. And something inside him that had been locked for a very long time shifted like a bolt sliding free. The homestead sat 5 miles northwest of town, set against the foothills like a hand pressed flat against the earth. It was modest, a sturdy wooden house with a covered porch that faced west toward the setting sun, a barn that needed paint and probably a new roof, a chicken coop, a small vegetable garden fenced against rabbits, fields of wheat stretching out behind the house toward the mountains, golden and dry in the late summer heat. It was not much, but it was real. It was built by hands that meant to stay, and it had the solidity of a place that had been loved even when loving it was hard. Hayes began work the next morning before the sun cleared the mountains. He started with the fence. Half a mile of it was down on the north boundary, posts rotted through, wire sagging or broken entirely. He dug new post holes in hard-pan soil that fought the shovel at every inch, swinging a pick to break through the callous layer underneath, sweat soaking through his shirt before the sun was fully up. He set the posts in tamped earth and strung barbed wire with leather gloves that still could not prevent the cuts. By noon, his palms were crisscrossed with thin red lines and his shoulders burned from the work, and the shirt on his back was stiff with dried sweat and fresh dust. Robert worked alongside him. The older man could not do the heavy digging, but he held posts steady and handed tools and kept up a steady rhythm of work that spoke of decades of practice. He did not talk much, did not ask questions. He tested Hayes by watching, and Hayes understood the test because he had been tested by quiet men before. In the Army, the officers who said the least were the ones whose approval mattered most. Hayes worked without complaint, without shortcuts, without being asked twice. When Robert pointed at a stretch of fence that needed mending, Hayes mended it. When water needed hauling from the creek because the well was running slow, Hayes hauled it. When wood needed splitting for the cook stove and the fireplace, Hayes split it until the pile was high enough to last 2 weeks, and his arms felt like they were filled with sand. On the 3rd day, Robert handed him a cup of coffee at the end of the workday and said, "You will do." It was the highest compliment Robert Forsyth was capable of giving. Rebecca, still recovering, refused to rest. Hayes found this out the hard way when he came in from the north pasture at mid-morning and discovered her in the kitchen garden, on her knees in the dirt, weeding around the tomato plants with her bandaged side pressed against her arm to keep the movement from pulling at the stitches. He stopped at the garden fence, crossed his arms, waited until she looked up. "My stitches are holding because that wound is staying still," he said. "You tear them open being stubborn, and I will have to do it all over again. Neither of us wants that." She glared at him. It was a remarkable glare, the kind that could wilt a sunflower at 30 paces. But then something unexpected happened. She laughed, a short, surprised sound like she had forgotten she could make it. Like laughter was a tool she had put away on a high shelf after her mother died, and was startled to find she could still reach it. Hayes looked away too quickly, but the corner of his mouth twitched. "There are things I need to do," she said, getting to her feet and brushing dirt from her skirt. "This garden does not weed itself. The chickens need feeding. The bread will not bake itself. Somebody has to keep this household running. Somebody does. But that somebody does not have to do all of it alone." She went still. Something flickered in her eyes, quick as a minnow in shallow water. He had said something that touched a nerve he did not know was there. "I have always done it alone," she said. Her voice was quiet. "Since Mama died." Thomas left. Pa tries, but his health. She stopped, pressed her lips together. "I manage." Hayes looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "I know you do, but managing and living are not the same thing." She opened her mouth, closed it, opened it again. Then she turned back to the tomato plants and pulled a weed with more force than the weed probably deserved. A few days later, Robert sent them into town together for supplies. "Medicine for his knee," he said, though they all knew it was not his knee. Hayes drove the wagon. Rebecca sat beside him on the bench, her notebook in her lap, her bonnet shading her face. They did not talk for the first mile. The road passed the Miller homestead. Hayes pulled the wagon to a stop without being asked, without even thinking about it. He sat looking at the abandoned house for a long moment. Then he set the brake and climbed down. Rebecca climbed down after him, moving carefully, one hand pressed against her bandaged side. They walked through the gate together. The hinges screamed rust. The house was still furnished. That was the worst part. The Miller family had left in such haste or such despair that they had taken only what they could carry on their backs. The kitchen table still had 4 chairs around it. Dishes sat in the dry sink, a coffee cup with a brown ring at the bottom where the last cup had evaporated. In the bedroom, the bed was made, quilt smoothed flat, as if someone might come back to sleep in it. In the main room, on the floor near the cold fireplace, a child's rag doll lay face down. Its yarn hair was tangled and one button eye was missing. It had been dropped, left behind. No one had come back to pick it up. Rebecca knelt slowly and picked up the doll, held it in both hands. Her thumbs moved over the yarn hair in a gesture that was almost unconscious, the way you smooth a child's hair back from their face before they fall asleep. Hayes stood in the doorway and watched her. "This is why I never had a home," he said quietly. His voice was not bitter. It was factual, the way you might say, "This is why I carry a canteen in the desert, because a home can be taken from you." Rebecca looked up at him. The rag doll was still in her hands. She looked at it, looked at the empty house, looked at the cold fireplace and the abandoned bed and the dishes in the sink that no one would ever wash. "This is why I will never lose mine," she said. They stood there in the dead house, 2 people looking at the same wreckage and seeing 2 different things. He saw the reason to never attach. She saw the reason to hold on until your fingers bled. Same fear, different armor. They drove on to town, picked up the supplies, did not speak about the Miller homestead again. But something had shifted between them. Some invisible wall had thinned, and when their shoulders bumped as the wagon hit a rut on the way home, neither moved away. That evening, Hayes checked Rebecca's wound. The bandage change had become ritual, performed on the porch in the failing light because the porch had the best air circulation and because neither of them acknowledged the real reason, which was that the porch was private and the light was kind. And the act of his hands on her skin, clinical and careful as it was, had become the closest thing to intimacy either of them had known in a very long time. His fingers peeled back the bandage. The wound was healing clean, the stitches holding, the skin around them pink and warm, but not hot. No infection, no spreading redness. He cleaned it with a cloth dampened with boiled water, applied fresh salve, and rebandaged it with sure movements. His hands were gentle, professional. They touched her with the detachment of a man performing a medical procedure and nothing more. but she felt it like voltage, like the air before a lightning strike, charged and trembling and full of something about to happen. And when he pulled his hands away, he pulled them away too fast, the way you pull your hand back from a flame. Not because it does not feel good, because it feels too good. Because if you leave it there 1 second longer, you will not pull it back at all. She noticed. She always noticed. That night, after supper, after Robert had gone to bed early because his breathing was bad, Rebecca stepped onto the porch and found a wildflower on the doorstep. A California poppy, orange as sunset, its petals still dewy from the evening cool. She picked it up, looked out toward the field where Hayes was walking the perimeter, checking the new fence posts, his silhouette dark against the last light of day. He did not look back, but the back of his neck was red, and it was not from the sun. She stood on the porch for a long time, holding the flower, watching him work. Then she went inside and pressed the poppy between the pages of her notebook, on the page where she had written that morning, in small, careful letters. He stayed. She did not write who. She did not need to. In the bunkhouse that night, Hayes lay on the narrow cot and stared through the gap in the roof at the stars. The same stars he had slept under 10,000 times. But they looked different from here. From this particular piece of ground, with the smell of wheat and warm earth, and the distant sound of crickets, and the faint glow of lamplight from the house where Rebecca was writing in her notebook, cataloging the day, controlling what she could. The flashback started to come. It always did, in the quiet, in the dark, when there was nothing else to fill the space. The sounds first, always the sounds, the screaming, the sawing, the wet slap of amputated limbs hitting the floor of the operating tent. Then the images. Billy Curtis's face, the blood, the shaking hands. Hayes closed his eyes, waited for it to take him. But instead of surrendering, instead of letting the memories drag him down into the dark water where he usually spent his nights, he turned his head and looked toward the house. The light in Rebecca's window was still on. She was awake, writing, planning, controlling. He watched the light and he breathed, and he stayed where he was. He did not saddle his horse. He did not ride away in the dark the way he had ridden away from a dozen places before this one. He stayed. The bullet arrived before the sound. It punched through the fence post 3 inches from Hayes Caldwell's head, spraying splinters into his cheek, and in the half-second between impact and the crack of the rifle echoing off the foothills, he knew with the certainty of a man who had been waiting 7 years for this moment that Jack Curtis had found him. He hit the ground. Instinct, older than thought, rolled behind the nearest post and lay flat in the dirt, his hand already on his revolver, his eyes scanning the tree line 200 yards to the north. The rifle shot had come from the pines up on the ridge, a high-angle shot, the kind you made when you wanted to put the fear of God into a man without actually putting a bullet in him. A warning shot, not a kill shot. Curtis wanted him to know he was there, wanted him to know he could have taken the shot, wanted him afraid. Hayes waited. 5 minutes. 10. The wind moved through the grass and the sun beat down, and nothing else happened. No second shot. No movement in the trees. Curtis had delivered his message and withdrawn. Hayes stood slowly, checked his body for damage. The splinters in his cheek were bleeding but superficial. His hands were steady. That was something. His hands were always steady when the danger was immediate, when there was something to do. It was afterward, when the danger had passed and the body remembered what the mind tried to forget, that the shaking came. He walked to the fence post. The bullet had buried itself deep in the wood, a .44 caliber round from the look of it. Standard Winchester load. He dug it out with his knife and turned it over in his fingers. Then he saw what was on the ground beside the post, placed there deliberately, weighted down with a small stone so the wind would not take it. A photograph. Hayes picked it up and the world tilted under his feet. It was a small photograph, 2 inches by 3. the kind soldiers had taken before they shipped out. A young man in a Confederate uniform standing stiff and awkward in front of a painted backdrop. Blonde hair cut short, eyes wide and a little frightened. A face that had not yet learned to shave, let alone to kill. On the back, in faded brown ink, someone had written, Private Billy Curtis, 1864, age 16. Hayes held the photograph, and 13 years collapsed like a telescope, folding in on themselves until the distance between then and now was nothing at all. He was 19 again, bone-tired, standing in a canvas tent that stank of blood and chloroform and death, surrounded by men whose bodies had been opened by bullets and bayonets, and whose screams had long since merged into a single continuous sound that never stopped, even when they did. The field hospital sat outside Appomattox. The war was over. Lee had surrendered that morning, April 9th, 1865. But the wounded kept coming because war does not stop when generals shake hands. It stops when the last man bleeds out, and that takes longer than anyone wants to think about. They brought the boy in on a stretcher. A Confederate private, 16 years old, gut wound. His gray uniform was soaked red from the waist down. The stretcher bearers were Union soldiers who looked sick at what they were carrying. Hayes was the only surgeon still standing. Dr. Whitfield had collapsed from exhaustion 2 hours ago. Dr. Morrow had taken a stray bullet in the shoulder and was lying on his own table being stitched up by a nurse. That left Hayes, 19 years old, 3 days without sleep, hands that shook like leaves in a November wind. He operated. The abdominal artery was torn, shredded by a bullet fragment that had tumbled through the boy's insides like a ball in a china shop. Hayes needed to clamp it, needed to stop the bleeding, needed his hands to be steady for just 5 minutes, just 3, just long enough to get the clamp around the artery and cinch it shut. The clamp slipped. His fingers, slick with blood and trembling with exhaustion, could not hold it. He tried again, slipped again. The blood came in pulses, rhythmic and relentless, and each pulse carried a little more of the boy's life out of his body and onto the table and onto the floor and onto Hayes's hands. The boy looked up at him. His eyes were blue, pale as river ice, and they were already going distant, already looking at something beyond the canvas ceiling of the tent. "Tell Jack I was not scared," the boy said. Then the light went out of his eyes, quietly, like a candle pinched between 2 fingers. Hayes stood over the body with blood on his hands up to the wrists, and the clamp still held uselessly in his shaking fingers. Outside the tent, visible through a gap in the canvas flap, a Confederate sergeant stood motionless. He was a big man, broad-shouldered, with a face that looked like it had been carved from granite by someone who did not believe in smiling. He had watched the entire operation through the gap in the canvas. He had watched his brother die. The sergeant's name was Jack Curtis. He was 22 years old. He had promised his mother he would bring Billy home. And as he stood outside that tent and watched the Union doctors' shaking hands fail to save the only person left in the world who mattered to him, something inside Jack Curtis that was already cracked broke clean through. He did not scream, did not charge into the tent, did not reach for a weapon. He simply stood there, still as stone. And when Hayes finally looked up and met his eyes through the gap in the canvas, Hayes saw something he would never forget. Not hatred. Hatred would have been simpler. What he saw was a promise, a quiet, absolute, unshakable promise that one day, no matter how long it took, the man with the shaking hands would answer for what he had done. That was 13 years ago. Hayes had been running ever since. And now, standing in a California wheat field with a dead boy's photograph in his hand and a bullet hole in the fence post next to his head, the running was over. He understood the geometry of it now. Curtis had tracked him to San Bernardino, had been in the alley that Saturday afternoon waiting for a clear strike. Hayes had been on the opposite boardwalk, an easy target. But Rebecca Forsythe had run between them, chasing after a boy she did not know, throwing herself into the gap between hunter and prey. She was never the target. She bled because of Hayes, because he had not left town fast enough, because Curtis's knife was meant for him, and she got in the way. The girl he was falling in love with had been stabbed because of his sins, and he had not told her, had let her believe it was random violence, a stranger's bad luck, a wrong place, wrong time accident. He had lied by omission, and now the lie was a living thing growing between them, fed by every gentle touch and every careful bandage change and every wildflower left on a doorstep. Hayes put the photograph in his pocket. He stood at the fence line and looked toward the house where Rebecca was hanging laundry in the yard, her dark hair catching the sunlight, her movements careful and measured to protect her healing side. He had a decision to make. He could leave. Ride out tonight. Curtis would follow him. That was the whole point of the photograph, the warning shot. Curtis was saying, I know where you are. I know who you are with. Come out and face me, or I will come in and take everything. If Hayes left, he would draw Curtis away from the homestead, away from Rebecca, away from Robert and the farm and the life he was starting to imagine might be possible. Or he could stay and fight, stay and protect them. But staying meant putting the Forsyths in danger. Staying meant Curtis might use them as leverage. Staying meant the violence would come here to this quiet place with its wheat fields and its porch sunsets and its California poppies. Hayes chose to stay. He told himself it was strategy. Curtis would expect him to run and would be prepared for that. Staying was the unexpected move. He told himself it was tactical. He could prepare the ranch for defense, create fallback positions, turn the homestead into a place that was costly to attack. But the truth was simpler and more selfish than tactics. He could not leave her. He had tried not to care, had maintained his professional distance, his emotional wall, his polite detachment, and none of it had worked. Because you cannot build a wall high enough to keep out a woman who saves strangers' children without thinking and laughs like she has just remembered that laughter exists and writes everything down in a leather notebook because the world took her mother and she will be damned if it catches her off guard again. He could not leave her. So he stayed and he prepared. He hid a loaded rifle in the barn behind the feed bin where it could be reached quickly. He placed a revolver in the kitchen in the flour tin wrapped in oilcloth. He taught Robert to shoot from the porch windows, framing the lessons as precautions against coyotes getting into the chicken coop. Robert was not fooled. Robert Forsyth had lived 60 years and had fought off claim jumpers and predators, both the four-legged and two-legged kind. He knew the difference between coyote precautions and war preparations, but he did not press. He took the rifle. He learned the positions. And he looked at Hayes with eyes that said, I know you are not telling me everything, but I know enough. That evening, Rebecca found Hayes at the fence line. He was standing where the bullet had struck the post, his hand resting on the splintered wood, his body coiled like a spring wound too tight. She noticed the fresh splinters in his cheek, noticed the way he stood, weight forward on the balls of his feet, hand near his hip, noticed the tension in his jaw. Who was shooting Hayes? He turned, met her eyes. Her gaze was not frightened. It was steady and sharp and patient. The gaze of a woman who knew she was not getting the whole truth and was willing to wait for it. He wanted to lie. Wanted to say it was a hunter, bad aim, nothing to worry about. But this woman had run in front of a loaded gun for a child she did not know. She had borne 12 stitches without laudanum and barely cried out. She deserved the truth. But the truth would cost him everything he had just begun to want. He gave her half of it. There is a man from the war who holds a grudge against me. He has been following me for some time. He is here now. I believe the shot was a warning. Rebecca listened. She did not interrupt. When he finished, she was quiet for a long moment. Is that all? That is all I can tell you right now. She studied him. Her eyes moved over his face with the careful attention of a woman reading a page of fine print, looking for the clauses hidden in the margins. You are telling the truth, she said slowly, but not all of it. You are telling truth the way a man rations water. just enough to keep from dying of thirst, not enough to drink your fill. Hayes said nothing, because she was right. She was exactly right, and the accuracy of it scared him more than Curtis's bullet. She turned and walked back toward the house. At the porch steps, she paused and looked back. Whatever you are not telling me, Hayes, it will come out eventually. The truth always does. I would rather hear it from you than discover it some other way, but I will not force it out of you. When you are ready, I will be here. She went inside. The screen door closed behind her with a soft slap. Hayes stood at the fence line and watched the light come on in her window. He put his hand in his pocket and felt the photograph of Billy Curtis, 16 years old, blonde hair, frightened eyes, dead on a table because a 19-year-old surgeon's hands would not stop shaking. He had survived 7 years of running. He was not sure he would survive Rebecca Forsyth's patience. Rebecca had learned in 3 years of running a household alone that men lied in predictable patterns. They lied about money. They lied about pain. And they lied about danger, always about danger, because they believed women could not carry the weight of knowing. Hayes Caldwell, for all his steadiness and his gentle hands, was no different. He had given her half a truth and expected her to swallow it whole. She was not that kind of woman. She had never been that kind of woman. Her mother had raised her to question, to observe, to trust her own judgment above the comfortable fictions men offered like peppermints to a child. She wrote in her notebook that night, "H.C. tells truth like a man rationing water, gives just enough to keep you from dying of thirst, not enough to drink your fill." She underlined rationing, but she did not push, not yet. She had learned patience the hard way from 3 years of watching her father's health decline while he insisted he was fine, from 3 years of running accounts that did not balance and finding ways to make them balance anyway. Patience was not her natural inclination. Her natural inclination was to grab problems by the throat and wrestle them to the ground. But she had learned that some problems could not be wrestled. Some had to be waited out, like fevers, like droughts. Like men who kept secrets because they believed keeping them was the same as keeping you safe. Meanwhile, life on the homestead continued in its rhythms. Hayes mended the barn roof. Rebecca brought him water and stayed to talk while he worked, passing the canteen up to where he straddled the ridge beam, his shirt sleeves rolled, his arms brown from the sun, his hands sure on the hammer. They talked about small things, the weather, the wheat crop, whether the chickens were laying less because of the heat or because of the coyote that had been prowling the edges of the property. In the evenings, Hayes read aloud from the books on the shelf in the main room. Rebecca's mother had been a reader, a rarity in this part of the country, and she had collected books the way other women collected china, poetry and novels, and a worn copy of the collected works of Shakespeare that had survived 3 moves and a flood. Hayes read well, his deep voice giving the words a weight and texture they did not have on the page. And Rebecca sat in her mother's chair and listened and tried not to think about how natural this felt, how right, how much it frightened her. Robert dozed by the fire while Hayes read. Sometimes he snored. Sometimes he simply sat with his eyes closed and the ghost of a smile on his face. And Rebecca knew he was not sleeping but listening, and that the sound of a voice reading aloud in this house was filling a silence that had been empty for 3 years. Their hands brushed when she passed him the coffee pot. Neither commented on it. Both noticed. Then Pete Sinclair was thrown from a horse. Pete was a hired hand at the neighboring ranch, 20 years old, hard-working, not particularly bright. His horse spooked at a rattlesnake and threw him against a fence post. The impact broke his leg in 2 places, including a compound fracture that sent the bone through the skin of his shin. Blood everywhere, the boy screaming. 2 ranch hands carried him to the Forsyth homestead because everyone within 10 miles knew that Hayes Caldwell had medical training and that the nearest doctor was in town 2 hours away. They laid Pete on the kitchen table. Hayes opened his surgical kit. Rebecca stood by with clean cloths and hot water, and the steady competence of a woman who did not flinch from blood. Hayes knelt beside the table, looked at the wound. The bone was white and jagged against the red flesh, poking through the skin at an angle that was wrong in a way that made the stomach rebel. Blood pulsed around it in steady throbs. He reached for the forceps. His hands began to shake. Not the small tremor that came sometimes when he was tired. This was different. This was the full-body memory rising up through his bones, triggered by the sight of exposed bone and pulsing blood and a young man's terrified eyes. Billy Curtis's eyes. Billy Curtis's blood. The field hospital and the shaking hands and the boy who said, "Tell Jack I was not scared." Hayes tried to pick up the forceps, dropped them. They clattered on the table and Pete screamed, and Robert, who was holding Pete's shoulders down, looked up with wide eyes. Hayes picked up the forceps again. His fingers closed around them and immediately opened as if the metal were hot. The trembling was violent now, visible to everyone in the room, and Hayes's face was white, his jaw clenched, his breath coming in short, sharp gasps. "I cannot," he said. His voice cracked on the word. "My hands. I cannot hold them still." The room was silent except for Pete's sobbing. Robert stared at Hayes. The ranch hands stared. And Rebecca, standing by the stove with a basin of hot water in her steady hands, made a decision. She set the basin down, crossed to the table, knelt beside Hayes, picked up the forceps. "Tell me what to do," she said. Her voice was calm, not falsely calm, not performing calm, actually calm. The calm of a woman who had spent 3 years handling every crisis that came through the door of this house, and who was not about to stop now because a man's hands would not cooperate. Hayes looked at her, looked at the forceps in her steady grip, looked at her eyes, brown and certain and waiting. He told her what to do. He talked her through it, step by step. How to grip the bone fragment, how to ease it back through the skin, how to align the pieces, how to apply pressure while he directed, how to hold while he instructed, how to move with precision while he provided the knowledge that his hands could not execute. She became his hands. Together they set the bone, cleaned the wound, applied the splint. Pete passed out halfway through, which was a mercy. When it was done and Pete's leg was wrapped and straight and the bleeding had stopped, the ranch hands carried him back to their wagon with gratitude that was almost embarrassing in its intensity. Afterward, Hayes sat in the barn with his head in his hands. The trembling had stopped now that the crisis was over, which was the cruel irony of the condition. His hands were steady when there was nothing to do, and useless when it mattered. Rebecca found him there. She did not rush to comfort him, did not say it is all right, or you did your best, or any of the other well-meaning platitudes that people offered when they did not understand. She simply sat down in the hay beside him and said nothing for a long time. The barn smelled of hay and horse, and the faint, lingering copper of blood from where Pete had bled on the way in. Dust motes floated in the slanting light from the door. Outside, a mockingbird sang. "Your hands did not fail you because you are broken," Rebecca said finally. "They failed because you are carrying something too heavy to hold alone. You could tell me what it is." Hayes was quiet. She watched his face in the dim light, watched the muscles work in his jaw, watched him struggle with something inside himself that was bigger than words. He almost told her. She could see it, the confession rising to his lips like water to the rim of a cup, trembling at the edge. But then he shook his head, slowly, like a man setting down something precious because he did not trust his grip. "Not yet," he said. "I am sorry. Not yet." She nodded, stood, brushed the hay from her skirt. "The offer does not expire, Hayes. Whenever you are ready." She left him alone in the barn. He sat there until the light changed and the shadows grew long and the mockingbirds stopped singing. 2 days later, Elijah Crow came to the Forsyth homestead. He arrived in a polished black buggy pulled by matched bay horses, driven by a silent man in a bowler hat. Crow himself stepped down with the careful precision of a man who considered dirt a personal insult. He wore a three-piece suit in the 100-degree heat, charcoal gray, with a gold watch chain across his vest, and a hat that had never seen a day of honest work. He was not tall, not physically imposing. He had the kind of face that was pleasant without being memorable. The face of a man who could sit in a room for an hour and leave no impression on anyone who had been there with him. His eyes were pale blue. His smile was frequent and empty. "Mr. Forsyth," he said, extending his hand to Robert. "Thank you for seeing me. I know you are a busy man." Robert shook the offered hand the way a man shakes the hand of a rattlesnake he has been forced to pick up. Briefly, without pleasure. Crow opened his leather portfolio and presented the documents with the smooth confidence of a man who had done this before and expected the same result he always got. A purchase offer for the homestead. Fair market value, he said, which was generous considering. 6-week deadline, cash payment. Robert listened. His face was stone. When Crow finished, Robert said, "The land is not for sale." Crow smiled. "Of course, I understand your attachment. But the mortgage payment is due in 8 weeks, Mr. Forsyth, and I believe you may find the terms less favorable than you remember. Interest adjustments, standard banking practice." He paused. "I would hate to see this beautiful property go to auction. You would get far less at auction than I am offering now." The threat was delivered with all the violence of a man pouring tea. Hayes had been standing by the barn, watching. He walked over now, positioning himself beside Robert, with the easy, casual menace of a man who wanted you to know he was armed without actually showing you the weapon. Crow turned to him, assessed him with pale eyes that missed nothing. "You must be the hired hand. Caldwell, is it?" Hayes nodded. "I have heard about you. War veteran, medical training, drifting cowboy." Crow's smile widened. "An interesting combination. Most men pick a lane." Hayes said nothing. Crow gathered his documents and returned to his buggy. Before climbing in, he paused beside Rebecca, who had come out to the porch when she heard voices. "You might ask your hired man why he sleeps with a gun under his pillow, Miss Forsyth," he said, quietly. "Just for her. A woman should know what kind of man is sleeping under her roof." Then he tipped his hat and drove away, his buggy raising a plume of dust that hung in the still air long after he was gone. That night, Rebecca woke to screaming. Not human screaming, animal screaming. A sound that started low and rose to a pitch that drilled into the bones and would not stop. She was out of bed and pulling on her boots before she was fully awake, her side protesting as she moved too fast. Outside, Hayes and Robert were already at the paddock. The old mare, Rebecca's mother's horse, the one that had refused to cross the gate on the morning of the stabbing, was down. She lay on her side in the dirt, her legs jerking in spasms, foam pouring from her mouth. Her eyes were rolled back to the whites, and her breathing was a horrible, wet, rattling sound. "Poison," Hayes said. He knelt beside the horse, checked her mouth, her eyes, the rhythm of her convulsions. Something she ate, or something put in her water. There was nothing clinical in his voice now. There was anger, barely contained, held back by the thinnest thread. "Can you save her?" Rebecca asked. Hayes looked at the horse, looked at the foam and the convulsions, and the eyes that had already gone beyond seeing. "No," he said. "I am sorry." The mare died before dawn. She thrashed in the dirt for an hour and then went still, her great body shuddering one final time before the breath left her. Robert knelt beside her the whole time, stroking her mane, saying her name. "Bess, Bess. Easy, girl. Easy now." When it was over, Robert cried. It was the first time Rebecca had seen her father cry since her mother's funeral, and it broke something inside her that she had not known was still intact. This horse had carried her mother. This horse was the last living thing her mother had touched, the last warm, breathing creature connected to the woman who had made this house a home. And now it was dead, poisoned. Murdered by a man in a three-piece suit who saw the land as a commodity and the people on it as obstacles. There was no proof it was Crow. There was no proof it was not. Rebecca went inside. The house was quiet, dark. She lit a lamp and sat at the kitchen table, opened her mother's Bible. took out the letter. She had written it 3 weeks ago. A letter to Pacific Land and Rail, offering to sell the homestead at a price that would cover the mortgage debt and leave enough to move Robert somewhere safe, somewhere with a doctor nearby, somewhere without men like Elijah Crow. The letter was unsigned. She had not been able to bring herself to sign it, but she had not been able to throw it away either. It lived in the pages of her mother's Bible like a secret sin, and every time she opened the book, she felt its weight. She picked up the pen, dipped it in ink, held the nib above the signature line. Her hand hovered there, trembling. The kitchen door opened. Hayes walked in, his boots heavy on the wooden floor, his hands still dirty from burying the horse. She shoved the letter under the Bible and turned to face him. He looked at her. She looked at him. Neither spoke. The lamplight made shadows on the wall that shifted like living things. "Are you all right?" he asked. "No," she said. "I am not. But I will be." He nodded, crossed to the stove and put the kettle on, made coffee without asking if she wanted any, poured 2 cups and set one in front of her and sat down across the table with the other. They sat there in the kitchen, drinking coffee in the dark, while outside the stars wheeled overhead, and the grave of the old mare was a fresh wound in the earth of the paddock. Later on the porch, they sat together and she told him about her mother, about the way she used to sing while she worked, about the books she loved, about the garden she had planted with seeds she carried all the way from Missouri, about the horse, about the silence that had filled the house after the funeral. A silence that was not empty but heavy, packed with all the words that would never be said, all the songs that would never be sung, all the pages that would never be turned. Hayes listened. He did not interrupt. He did not offer comfort or platitudes. He listened the way a man listens when he understands that sometimes the most important thing you can do for another person is simply to hear them. Their hands found each other on the porch railing. His fingers were rough and calloused and warm. Hers were smaller, work-hardened, steady. They held on. Neither pulled away. When Rebecca went inside, she looked back through the screen door. Hayes sat motionless on the porch, staring into the darkness as if waiting for it to swallow him. And she thought, Elijah Crow was wrong. She did not need to ask why Hayes kept a gun under his pillow. She needed to ask why he never slept. Truth had a nasty habit of choosing its own timing. It did not care about readiness or context, or whether the people involved had enough love stored up to survive what came next. It just arrived, like a bullet, and you dealt with the damage after. Sheriff Tom Barker rode out to the Forsyth homestead on a Tuesday morning when the sky was clear and the heat had not yet reached its full punishment. He came alone. His horse was lathered, which meant he had ridden hard, and his face had the particular look of a man who is about to do something he would regret for the rest of his life, but could not see a way around it. Rebecca was in the garden when she saw him coming up the road. She straightened, pressing her hand against her side where the scar still pulled when she moved too quickly, and watched him approach with the careful attention she gave to everything. Hayes was in the barn, replacing a rotted beam in the hayloft. She heard his hammer stop when the hoofbeats reached the yard. He appeared in the barn doorway, his hand already near his hip, his eyes tracking the rider. "Sheriff Barker," Rebecca called from the garden. "Something I can help you with?" Barker dismounted, tied his horse to the post, removed his hat. He was sweating, and not just from the heat. "Miss Forsyth, I need to speak with you." He glanced at Hayes. "Alone, if that is all right." Hayes did not move. Rebecca crossed the yard, pulling off her gardening gloves. "It is fine, Hayes. I will call if I need you." Hayes held Barker's eyes for a long moment. Then he nodded and went back into the barn. But he did not go back to the hayloft. He positioned himself just inside the door, close enough to hear her if she raised her voice. Rebecca led Barker into the kitchen, offered him water, which he accepted, coffee, which he declined. She sat down at the table and waited. Barker stood, turned his hat in his hands, looked at the floor, the ceiling, the window, anything but her. "Miss Forsyth, I am going to tell you something because I think you deserve to know. And because if I do not tell you, someone worse will." Rebecca's hands went still on the table. She did not reach for her notebook. She did not move. Barker told her about Billy Curtis, about the field hospital at Appomattox, about a 19-year-old Union surgeon named Hayes Caldwell who had operated on a 16-year-old Confederate soldier with a gut wound, about the shaking hands, about the blood that would not stop, about the boy who died on the table while his older brother watched through the canvas flap. He told her about Jack Curtis, about 13 years of tracking, about a vendetta that had crossed 3 states and 7 years of running, about a knife in an alley in San Bernardino. And then he told her the part that stopped her heart. The man who stabbed you, Miss Forsyth. He was not after you. He was after Caldwell. You ran between them. You were never the target. The kitchen was very quiet. The clock on the mantel ticked. Outside, a meadowlark sang. Rebecca sat at the table and felt the ground beneath her shift, the way it shifts during an earthquake, slow at first and then all at once, until everything you thought was solid turns out to be sand. She thought about Hayes kneeling beside her in the street. Not a stranger helping a stranger. A guilty man trying to atone. She thought about Hayes staying at the ranch, not because he wanted to be near her, because he was protecting her from his enemy. She thought about every gentle touch, every careful bandage change, every evening on the porch, every wildflower left on the doorstep. And she wondered with a cold clarity that hurt worse than the knife, whether any of it had been real, or whether it was all just guilt wearing the mask of tenderness. "Who sent you here, Sheriff?" she asked. Her voice was level, controlled. The notebook version of herself, all facts, no feeling. Barker flinched. "Nobody. I came on my own." He was lying. She could see it in the way his eyes moved, in the tension in his jaw, in the way his fingers whitened on the brim of his hat. Someone had sent him. Someone who wanted Hayes off this ranch. Elijah Crow. The understanding hit her like a slap. Crow had sent the sheriff to reveal the truth, not out of concern for Rebecca, but as a weapon. Drive Hayes away. Leave the ranch unprotected. Then move in for the kill. She was being played. They were all being played. But knowing you were being played did not make the truth any less true. "Thank you, Sheriff," she said. "I think you should go now." Barker left. He passed Hayes in the barn doorway, and the two men looked at each other, and in the space between their eyes, something was communicated that did not require words. Rebecca sat in the kitchen for a long time. The clock ticked. The shadows moved across the floor. She did not write in her notebook. She did not make lists or plans. She sat with her hands flat on the table and felt the architecture of the last 6 weeks crumble inside her like a house built on bad ground. Then she stood up, crossed the yard, walked into the barn. Hayes was standing by the workbench. He turned when she came in. His face was wary, but not surprised. He knew. She could see it in his eyes. He had been waiting for this. "Billy Curtis," she said. Her voice did not waver. 16 years old. Died on your operating table, April 9th, 1865. Hayes went white. Every drop of color drained from his face as if someone had pulled a plug. "Who told you? Does it matter?" "You should have told me. From the very first day. I was trying to protect you. I was stabbed because of you, Hayes." She took a step closer. Her voice cracked for the first time. "That is not protection. That is a lie with a bandage on it." The silence that followed was the worst silence she had ever heard. Worse than the silence after her mother's funeral. Worse than the silence of the empty house on the nights when her father went to bed without speaking. This was the silence of two people standing in the wreckage of something they had been building without ever naming it and realizing that the foundation had been rotten all along. She waited for him to fight, to explain, to give her something, anything, a reason to forgive, a truth that made the lies make sense. He did not, because she was right, and he knew it. "I will leave," he said. "Curtis followed me here. When I am gone, he will follow me out. You will be safe." She said nothing. He took his saddlebag from the hook on the wall, his surgical kit, his bedroll, his rifle. He moved with the mechanical efficiency of a man who had packed up and moved on so many times that his hands knew the motions without his mind's participation. He walked to the door, paused. His hand rested on the frame, and she could see his knuckles white against the wood. And she knew that if she said one word, just one, he would stay. She said nothing. Hayes Caldwell walked out of the barn and across the yard, and she watched him saddle his horse and tie his gear and mount up, and she watched him ride down the road toward town, growing smaller with each stride of the horse, until he was just a shape against the sunset, and then just a memory, and then gone. Rebecca stood in the barn doorway for a long time after he left. The evening came on. The light turned gold and then amber, and then the deep purple of a California dusk. The crickets began their singing. She went inside. The house was quiet. Robert was in his room. She could hear his breathing, labored and rattling, through the closed door. She sat down at the kitchen table and put her head in her hands and pressed her palms against her eyes until she saw stars. She did not cry. Crying was a luxury she could not afford. Crying was for women who had someone to hold them afterward, and she was alone again, the way she had been alone for 3 years. The way she would always be alone, because that was what happened when you trusted someone. They left. The front door opened. Robert stood in the hallway, one hand on the door frame for support. He was holding a piece of paper. Rebecca had not noticed, in the aftermath of the confrontation with Hayes, that she had knocked the Bible off the kitchen shelf, that the letter, her unsigned, unsent letter to Pacific Land and Rail, had fallen out of its pages and onto the floor. Robert had found it. Robert had read it. He stood in the doorway holding the letter, and his face was the color of ashes after a fire has burned out. "You were going to sell the ranch," he said. Not a question, a statement. Flat and final as a coffin lid. Rebecca's world, already cracked from the loss of Hayes, split wide open. Pa. I can explain. I was not going to send it. I wrote it because I was scared. Your health, the debts, Crow, everything. I was trying to find a way to save you. By selling the only thing your mother and I built together. By giving it to the people who are trying to take it from us. Robert's voice was not loud. It was worse than loud. It was quiet, with the particular quietness of a man whose last illusion about his daughter has just been shattered. I was wrong. I know I was wrong. Robert set the letter on the table with the careful precision of a man placing a headstone. Then he walked to his bedroom and closed the door. The click of the latch was the quietest sound Rebecca had ever heard, and the loudest. She stood alone in the kitchen. The house was emptier than it had been since the day they buried her mother. Hayes was gone. Her father's trust was broken, and she realized with a clarity that cut deeper than any knife that she had become the very thing she feared most. The reason someone she loved walked away. Hayes Caldwell left the Forsyth homestead at dusk, and by noon the next day he knew he had made the worst mistake of his life. Not because he missed Rebecca, though he missed her the way a body misses blood, a constant draining ache that no amount of riding or distance could ease, but because he found the tracks of 6 horses on the road that led back toward the ranch, and all 6 were riding hard. He had stopped at the crossroads outside San Bernardino to water his horse and fill his canteen. The tracks were fresh, cut deep into the dust. 6 riders, shod horses, heading northwest, toward the Forsyth homestead. He rode into town, left his horse at the livery, walked the streets with his hat low and his ears open. It did not take long. In a town the size of San Bernardino, news traveled faster than telegraph. In the saloon, 2 cowboys from the Johnson Ranch were talking over whiskey. Hayes bought them around and sat down. "Heard Crow is making his move on the Forsyth place," one of them said. "A man named Jim Talbot, lean and leathery and not easily impressed. Hired some hard cases. That fellow Curtis, the one the sheriff has been looking for. 3 or 4 others. When? Soon. Maybe today. The other cowboy, a young man named Clyde, shook his head. Heard the old man's cowboy left, the one who did the doctoring. Without him, it is just the old man and the girl. Hayes set his whiskey down. The glass hit the table harder than he intended. I need help, he said. He looked at Talbot, looked at Clyde. 2 men. Not enough against 6, but he did not have time to recruit an army. Talbot studied him. I worked cattle with you last spring at the Johnson place. You are a straight shooter and you do not scare easy. What are we riding into? 6 men, maybe armed. They mean to burn the family out and take the land. That is Crow's doing? Yes. Talbot finished his whiskey. Set the glass down, looked at Clyde. Clyde nodded. We will ride with you, Talbot said. But if I get shot, you are sewing me up. They mounted up. 3 men, 3 horses, dust rising behind them in a column that caught the afternoon sun like smoke. Hayes pushed the pace as hard as the horses could stand. 5 miles northwest, maybe 40 minutes at a hard lope, maybe not enough time. As they rode, Hayes thought about Curtis. Not about the vendetta or the guilt or the 13 years of running. About the man himself. About the look in his eyes through the canvas flap of the field hospital tent. Not hatred. A promise. A promise that had consumed everything Jack Curtis might have been and left behind only what he was. A killer. A ghost. A man whose hands shook just as badly as Hayes's own, broken by the same war, hollowed by the same grief, but with no one to steady them. In a lean-to camp in the foothills above San Bernardino, Jack Curtis sat on a rock and cleaned his revolver. The weapon was old, a Colt .44, the same one he had carried through the war. He knew every scratch and nick on the barrel the way a man knows the lines on his own face. He laid Billy's photograph on the flat rock beside him and talked to it the way he did every night. The photograph was creased and faded, the edges worn soft from handling, and the face in it was losing definition, becoming a ghost of a ghost. But Curtis still saw it clearly, would always see it clearly. The blonde hair, the frightened eyes, the uniform that was too big in the shoulders because Billy had not finished growing yet and never would. Almost done, kid. Almost. He looked at his hands. They were trembling. The right one, worse than the left, had been trembling since the war, since that day in the field hospital tent when the world ended and kept going at the same time. He clenched them into fists, opened them, clenched them again. The shaking did not stop. It never stopped. He thought about the girl he had stabbed. That was not what he had planned. She was not the target. She had run between him and Caldwell at the worst possible moment, a stranger's courage disrupting a 13-year-old plan. He remembered the moment the blade went in. The shock on her face. Not fear, not hatred. Surprise. Genuine astonishment that a stranger would hurt her, as if the cruelty of the world was news to her, as if she had somehow reached her 20s without learning that people were capable of this. Billy used to look like that. When the older boys stole his lunch, when the sergeant cuffed him for marching out of step, that same bewildered innocence. Curtis's hand had faltered. The blade went deep enough to wound, but not deep enough to kill. He had not intended mercy. His hand had simply refused to go further. He hated himself for that hesitation, and he hated himself for hating it, and he hated the girl for having Billy's eyes. Tomorrow, he told the photograph. Tomorrow. It is done. At the Forsyth homestead, Rebecca woke to silence. The house was cold despite the morning sun. Robert was already up, sitting at the kitchen table drinking coffee. He did not look at her when she came in. She made breakfast, eggs from the chickens, biscuits from the last of the flour. She set a plate in front of him. He ate without speaking. The silence was suffocating. It pressed in from all sides like floodwater, filling the spaces where words should have been. Rebecca had lived with silence for 3 years. The silence of a house without a mother, the silence of a father who had stopped talking, the silence of a brother who had left. She knew every variety of quiet. But this silence was different. This was the silence of betrayal, and it had teeth. She broke first. I was wrong. I know I was wrong. I was scared of losing you, and I made a decision that was not mine to make." Robert set his fork down. His face was still ashen, his breathing still labored, but something in his eyes softened a fraction of a degree. "Your mother did the same thing, you know. Tried to sell this place when I got sick the first time. I found the letter in her sewing basket." He almost smiled. The ghost of a smile, there and gone like heat lightning. I was furious. Did not speak to her for a week, worst week of my life. Rebecca's breath caught. What changed? She told me the truth, said she would rather have me alive and poor than dead and proud. Said the land was just dirt without the people on it. He met Rebecca's eyes for the first time since finding the letter. She was right. And so are you. But so am I. This land is what we have left of her. I will not sell it. Not to Crow, not to anyone. "Then we fight for it," Rebecca said. Robert looked at her with the weary fondness of a man who recognizes his own stubbornness reflected in his child. "With what?" "Hayes is gone. The bank is Crow's. Then we fight anyway." She took the letter from the table where Robert had left it, walked to the cook stove, opened the firebox door, held the letter over the flames for a moment, feeling the heat on her fingers, watching the edges begin to curl and darken. Then she dropped it in. The paper caught instantly. Curled, blackened, became ash. Robert watched it burn, and something in his posture eased, the way a fence post settles when the soil around it finally packs tight. They ate the rest of breakfast in a different kind of silence. Not comfortable exactly, but no longer hostile. The silence of two people who have hurt each other and know it and are choosing to sit with the hurt rather than run from it. The riders came in the afternoon. Rebecca saw them first. She was hanging laundry on the line behind the house when she noticed the dust cloud on the ridge to the north. 4 riders spread in a loose line, moving at a walk. No hurry. The walk of men who knew they were not going to meet resistance. She dropped the shirt she was holding and ran to the house. "Pa! Riders! 4 of them! Coming from the north ridge!" Robert reached for his rifle. His hand shook so badly he nearly dropped it. His face went gray and she saw him wince, saw his left hand press against his chest for just a moment before he caught himself. She took the rifle from him. Checked the load. Full magazine. 15 rounds. She had been shooting since she was 12, since her mother had insisted that a woman on the frontier should be able to defend herself. The riders crested the ridge and started down the slope toward the homestead. The one in the lead was tall, thin, riding a black horse. Even at distance, Rebecca recognized the way he sat in the saddle. The same man she had seen on the saloon porch the day they left town. The same man who had stood in the alley with a knife. Jack Curtis. The other 3 were strangers. Hard-looking men on working horses, the kind of men Crow would hire for dirty work. Not gunfighters, thugs. But thugs with guns were just as dangerous as professionals when there were 4 of them, and you were a woman with a rifle and an old man with a failing heart. Curtis stopped his horse 50 yards from the house. One of his men dismounted and walked to the barn with a torch. The dry timber caught in seconds, flames leaping up the walls and reaching for the roof like hungry orange fingers. Rebecca watched the barn burn. Her mother's barn. The barn where she had learned to ride. The barn where Hayes had sat with his head in his hands after his hands failed him. The barn where she had stood in the doorway and watched him leave. She raised the rifle. Curtis called out from his horse, "Send the old man out with the deed signed and nobody gets hurt worse." Rebecca fired. The bullet kicked dirt 2 feet in front of Curtis's horse. The animal shied, and Curtis controlled it with the ease of a born horseman. He looked at her. Standing on the porch, rifle at her shoulder, dark hair loose, the scar on her side hidden beneath her dress, but the scar on her soul on full display. He recognized her, and something complicated moved across his face. The brave girl. Last time it was a knife. This time it is bullets. Let us see which one you pick. Rebecca racked another round. "Go to hell," she said. Curtis smiled. It was not a cruel smile. It was the smile of a man who recognized courage even in his enemies, and who was too broken to be moved by it anymore. Stand off. Rebecca and Robert inside the house. 4 men outside. the barn blazing, smoke filling the sky. Rebecca calculated. 15 rounds, 4 men. Good odds if they stayed at distance. Bad odds if they rushed the house from different directions. Worse odds if they simply waited her out, let the fire spread, let the smoke drive them into the open. She reloaded with hands that shook, not from fear, from rage. Then she heard hoofbeats, distant at first, coming from the south, from town. Could be more of Curtis's men. Could be the end of everything. A rifle cracked from the hilltop behind the house. Not from the yard. From above. A high-angle shot that caught one of Curtis's riders square in the shoulder and knocked him clean out of the saddle. Rebecca knew that shot, knew the man who made it, knew him by the sound of the rifle and the precision of the aim and the direction from which it came. Hayes Caldwell had come back. And the thing that broke inside her chest was not fear and was not relief. It was the furious, ungovernable, absolutely certain knowledge that she was in love with him, and that she was going to kill him herself for leaving, right after he finished saving her life. Hayes Caldwell had killed men before, in the war, on the operating table, with scalpels and with helplessness. But he had never fired a rifle at a living human being with the clear, calm, absolute intention that he felt now, because none of those other times had been about Rebecca. He came down the hill with Talbot and Clyde on either side of him, firing as they rode. The element of surprise bought them 10 seconds. 10 seconds in a gunfight is an eternity. Curtis's hired men were not fighters. They were Crow's thugs, men who signed on for intimidation pay, for burning barns and poisoning horses and frightening old men. They were not prepared for return fire from a hilltop. They were not prepared for 3 men on horseback descending on them with rifles. The first one was already down from Hayes's initial shot, clutching his shoulder in the dirt. The second tried to run. Clyde put a bullet through the cantle of his saddle that was close enough to change his mind about fighting, and the man threw his gun in the dirt and put his hands up. The third spurred his horse hard, heading for the road, and Talbot let him go because a running man is not a threat. Hayes took a bullet, not badly. A graze across his left shoulder that burned like a hot iron, and bled freely but did not stop him. He felt it the way you feel a wasp sting in the middle of a fistfight, aware of it but unable to attend to it. Talbot went down behind the water trough, around through the fleshy part of his thigh. He cursed with impressive creativity and kept his rifle up. And then there was Curtis. Curtis did not run. While his hired men scattered and surrendered and fled, Jack Curtis dismounted from his black horse, dropped the reins in the dirt, stood in the yard with the barn burning behind him and the smoke rising in a column that could be seen for miles. He waited. Hayes dismounted, handed his rifle to Clyde, walked forward. The smoke drifted between them in gray wisps. Ash floated down like dark snow, 20 feet apart. 2 men, the burning barn at their backs, 13 years between them. "You let my brother die," Curtis said. Hayes stopped walking. He stood in the yard with blood running from his shoulder and ash in his hair, and the weight of 13 years of guilt pressing down on him, like the sky had decided to rest on his shoulders. I tried to save him. My hands were shaking. 3 days without sleep. I was 19 years old, and I tried, and I failed. That is not good enough, I know. I have lived with it every day for 13 years. I know it is not good enough. But I tried. Curtis's jaw worked. Something moved behind his eyes that was not hatred. Something older and sadder and more tired than hatred. Billy was 16. He did not even want to fight. Ma made him go, said it was his duty. His voice cracked, and for a moment the mask slipped and Hayes saw the man underneath. Not a killer. A brother. A broken brother who had spent 13 years trying to make someone pay for a loss that no amount of payment could settle. He was just a kid. "I know," Hayes said. "I remember his face. I have never stopped remembering his face." The fire crackled. A beam in the barn collapsed with a crash that sent sparks spiraling into the sky. Neither man flinched. Curtis spoke again. quieter now, almost a whisper. "When I cut that girl, your girl, I said your name. Did she tell you that? I said your name so you would know. So you would feel what I felt watching Billy die because of your shaking hands." Hayes said nothing. He felt the words like blows. But she looked at me. Curtis's voice broke. Right when the knife went in, she looked at me and I saw Billy. That same look, like she could not understand why someone would hurt her. My hand slipped. I did not go deep enough. I could have killed her, and I did not because for 1 second she had my brother's eyes. The yard was quiet except for the fire. Hayes felt something crack inside his chest. Not breaking, shifting. The way ice shifts on a river in spring. The whole frozen surface suddenly in motion after months of stillness. Curtis raised his gun, Hayes raised his, and Rebecca Forsythe walked out of the house and into the yard between them. She did not run. She walked, 1 step at a time, through the shell casings in the dirt, through the smoke, through the space between 2 armed men where a bullet could find her from either direction. She had done this before. In the street in San Bernardino, without thinking, driven by instinct and the sight of a child in danger. This time was different. This time she knew exactly what she was doing. This time the choice was deliberate. "Enough," she said. She looked at Curtis. His gun was still raised. His hand was shaking. His hand, shaking, just like Hayes's. "Your brother is dead," she said. Her voice was steady and clear and carried across the yard like a bell. "Killing Hayes will not change that. It will just make 2 dead boys instead of 1. Because Billy would be ashamed of what you have become. You know that. You have known it for 13 years. Curtis stared at her. At this woman he had stabbed in an alley. At the scar he had given her, hidden beneath her dress but present in her eyes. At the same face that had looked up at him with Billy's surprise and Billy's innocence, and Billy's inability to understand why someone would choose to cause pain. His gun hand trembled. The shaking traveled up his arm, through his shoulder, into his whole body. 2 broken men, same war, same wound, same trembling hands. Curtis dropped the gun. It hit the dirt with a sound like a period at the end of a sentence. He sank to his knees, put his head in his hands, and wept. Rebecca stood between them. The fire burned. The smoke rose. Hoofbeats coming from the road. Sheriff Barker and 2 deputies, riding hard, dust billowing behind them. Barker reined up in the yard, took in the scene, the burning barn, the wounded men. Robert Forsythe on the porch, gray-faced, 1 hand pressed against his chest, breathing like a man who had been running though he had not moved from his chair. Curtis on his knees in the dirt, Hayes bleeding from the shoulder. And behind Barker, riding hard on a borrowed horse, Mattie Henderson. Her skirts hiked up to her knees in a way that would have scandalized the town if anyone had been in a position to notice. She was waving papers. "Tom!" she shouted. "Tom Barker, you look at these before you do another blessed thing." Barker took the papers, read them. His face changed. They were documents from Crow's hotel room, letters, contracts, payment receipts, proof that Elijah Crow had hired Curtis and his men to terrorize homesteaders, proof that he had forged mortgage terms, proof that the entire campaign of intimidation and violence had been orchestrated from Crow's desk with Crow's money. Barker looked at the papers, looked at the burning barn, looked at Robert Forsythe on the porch. Robert, who had staked a claim beside him 26 years ago. Robert, who had helped him raise the walls of his first house. Robert, whose wife had nursed Barker's wife through her last illness. "Tom," Robert said. "Just the name. That was all." Barker looked at his badge, touched it with his thumb. Then he looked up and met Robert's eyes. He turned to his deputies. "We are riding back to town. We are going to the jail. But we are not locking anyone here up. We are locking up Elijah Crow." The younger deputy looked nervous. "Sir, Crow will tell everyone about the money he has been paying you. He will ruin you." "I know," Barker said. He took a breath. "I know. Do it anyway." He met Robert's eyes across the yard. I am sorry, Bobby, for all of it. I should have been better. Robert nodded. Nothing more needed to be said. Barker's deputies collected Curtis. He did not resist. He stood when they told him to stand, walked when they told him to walk. Let them put him on a horse. Before they led him away, he looked back at Hayes. The two men regarded each other across the yard, across 13 years of hunting and running and guilt and grief. No hatred left, no rage, just exhaustion. The bone-deep weariness of men who had been fighting a war that ended a long time ago and could not figure out how to stop. Hayes nodded once. Curtis nodded back. Two men acknowledging a debt that could never be fully settled, but did not have to be settled with blood. They rode away. The sound of hoofbeats faded into the distance. Hayes stood in the yard. Blood ran from his shoulder. Ash drifted in his hair. His legs felt like they might give out. Rebecca walked toward him, not running, not rushing, one step at a time. Through the shell casings and the smoke, she stopped in front of him, eye to eye. "Do not you ever leave again," she said. "No, ma'am. I am serious, Hayes." "Yes, ma'am." He looked at her. Smoke and ash and tears on her face, and the last light of the burning barn reflected in her eyes, and she was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. "I am not going anywhere, not ever again." She kissed him. Right there in the dirt yard, with the barn still smoldering and a surrendered man's horse standing confused in the vegetable garden, and her father watching from the porch with an expression that was equal parts exhaustion and approval. It was the least romantic and most honest kiss of her entire life. When she pulled back, he was looking at her the way a man looks at something he had stopped believing existed. "We are going to have a very long talk about honesty," she said. "Yes, we are. And you are going to tell me everything, starting from the beginning, every word." She believed him, not because he had earned it, not yet, but because she had decided to. And Rebecca Forsyth, once she decided something, did not change her mind. Spring came to San Bernardino 3 weeks late that year, as though even the season needed time to recover. The ranch was rebuilt. A new barn stood where the old one had burned, framed in fresh-cut pine that still smelled of sawdust, the boards bright and pale against the weathered brown of the house. Hayes and Robert had raised it together, board by board, post by post, with help from the Johnson Ranch cowboys and half a dozen neighbors who showed up without being asked and worked without being paid. The fields were green with winter wheat coming up. The irrigation ditch Hayes had designed, channeling water from the creek along a gentle grade to the lower fields, was working better than anyone had expected. The vegetable garden was twice the size it had been the year before. The chicken coop had a new roof. The fences were straight and tight for the first time in years. 4 months had passed since the burning. 4 months of healing, not just the ranch. Everything. Elijah Crow had been arrested by Sheriff Barker and charged by the San Bernardino County District Attorney with conspiracy, fraud, and incitement to violence. His assets were seized by the county. The fraudulent mortgage on the Forsyth homestead was voided by the circuit judge who rode through in November, a stern-faced man from Los Angeles who looked at Crow's doctored paperwork and used language from the bench that made Mattie Henderson blush. Crow sat in the county jail awaiting trial. The general expectation was that he would spend the next 10 years at the state prison in San Quentin, and no one in San Bernardino was inclined to shed tears about it. Sheriff Tom Barker had resigned his badge before the town council could strip it from him. He testified against Crow in the preliminary hearing, standing straight and speaking clearly and looking at the floor the way a man does when he is saying things that cost him everything and knows it. The judge, acknowledging his cooperation, sentenced him to 6 months in the county jail and 3 years prohibition from holding public office. Robert Forsyth was the only person who visited him. They sat on opposite sides of the bars and talked about the old days, about staking claims and building houses, and the way the valley used to look before the railroad came. Barker cried once. Robert pretended not to notice. Jack Curtis had pleaded guilty to assault at the county courthouse. The prosecutor had pushed for attempted murder. But Curtis's lawyer argued that the wound had been superficial for a knife attack, that Curtis had shown restraint, that there were mitigating circumstances. The judge sentenced him to 8 years at the state prison at San Quentin. Hayes wrote him a letter. It took him 3 weeks to write it, sitting at the kitchen table in the evenings after Rebecca and Robert had gone to bed, writing and crossing out and writing again. Not asking for forgiveness, not explaining. Just telling Curtis everything he remembered about the night Billy died. Every detail. The smell of the tent, the sound of the rain on the canvas, the color of Billy's eyes, the way the boy's hand had reached up and gripped Hayes's wrist, the same way Rebecca would grip it a decade later, and how Hayes had held on until there was nothing left to hold on to. He sent the letter through the prison warden. No response came. None was expected. But the writing of it, the act of putting every detail on paper, of telling the truth completely for the first time, felt like setting down a boulder he had been carrying uphill for 13 years. Rebecca's school was real now, not a dream she talked about on the porch in the evenings. A fact. She taught in the repaired barn 3 mornings a week, 8 students at the start, 12 by March. The youngest was 5, the oldest 14. She taught them reading and writing and arithmetic, and she taught them the way her mother had taught her, with patience and firmness, and the absolute conviction that every child deserved the chance to learn. Hayes had built her a chalkboard from planed pine, sanded smooth and painted with lamp black. It was not perfect. The surface was slightly uneven, and the frame was a fraction of an inch off square. She loved it more than anything she owned. Robert's health had stabilized. Hayes had written to a doctor in Los Angeles, a man he had known during the war, and described Robert's symptoms. The doctor recommended digitalis for the heart condition and sent a supply by mail coach. Robert grumbled about the cost and the taste and the indignity of taking medicine like an invalid. He took it anyway. He would not live forever, they all knew that. But he would live long enough to see what came next. And Hayes's hands had stopped shaking. Not entirely, not forever. There were still mornings when he woke from dreams of the field hospital and found his fingers trembling against the blankets. But the tremors were less frequent now, less violent, less consuming. The darkness was still there. It would always be there. But it no longer owned him. It was a tenant, not a landlord. And the rent it paid was getting smaller every month. On a warm afternoon in late April, Hayes drove the last fence post into the repaired north boundary. The fence line stretched straight and true from the property marker to the creek, new posts gleaming pale in the sun, wire tight and clean. He stepped back and looked at it with the quiet satisfaction of a man who has built something that will stand. Rebecca came out to the field. She was carrying a canteen and 2 cups. Her hair was loose from its pins, the way it always came loose by afternoon. Her dress was dusty from the school. There was chalk on her fingers and a smudge on her cheek, and she was smiling. She handed him the canteen. He drank, wiped his mouth with the back of his hand, looked at her. The sun was behind her. It caught the loose strands of her hair and turned them to dark gold. She stood there in the wheat field with the mountains behind her and the sky wide and blue and honest above her, and she was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. Not because of her face, though her face was lovely, because of what was behind it. The courage, the stubbornness, the steady, unshakable certainty that the world could be bent into a better shape if you were willing to put your back into it. "I do not have a ring," he said. "I do not have money. I do not have anything except these hands and a promise that I will never leave again. Will you marry me?" Rebecca looked at him, at his hands, at the fence he had built, at the new barn behind them, and the wheat field around them, and the mountains rising up like a promise of permanence. "You have the steadiest hands I have ever known," she said. "That is not an answer." "Yes, it is. Yes. It has been yes since you told me to breathe while you stitched me back together." He pulled her into his arms, kissed her in the wheat field with the sun warm on their backs and the wind carrying the smell of new growth and the distant sound of children laughing in the schoolhouse. The wedding was small. The church in San Bernardino, white-clapboard with a crooked steeple. Mattie Henderson stood as witness, wearing a dress that she had not worn in 8 years, and that fit a little tighter than she remembered. Robert walked Rebecca down the aisle slowly, leaning on her arm as much as she leaned on his. He wore his Sunday suit and his wife's wedding ring on a chain around his neck, and when he placed Rebecca's hand in Hayes's, he nodded once and sat down and pressed his handkerchief to his eyes and pretended it was the dust. The Johnson Ranch cowboys sat in the back row, cleaned up and deeply uncomfortable in borrowed collars that were too tight and boots that had been polished for the first time in their lives. Talbot's thigh was still bandaged, and he walked with a limp he would carry for the rest of his days. He considered it a fair trade. The boy Rebecca had saved sat in the front pew. His name was Daniel. He was 9 now, brown-haired, barefooted, wearing a clean shirt his mother had ironed that morning. His mother sat beside him, crying quietly, holding his hand. The preacher pronounced them husband and wife. Hayes kissed her. It was not gentle. It was not reverent. It was the kiss of a man who had finally, after 7 years of running and 13 years of guilt, and a lifetime of believing he did not deserve this, stopped running. They walked out of the church into the sunlight. Rice hit them from both sides, thrown by Mattie and the cowboys and a dozen neighbors. Rebecca laughed. Hayes grinned. Robert stood on the church steps and looked at the sky and said something too quiet for anyone else to hear. That night, their first night in the house as husband and wife, Rebecca could not sleep. The house was quiet. Robert was in his room, sleeping the deep sleep of a man who had taken his medicine and said his prayers, and was, for the first time in a long time, at peace. She slipped out of bed, pulled on her shawl, stepped onto the porch. The moon was up full and bright, painting the wheat fields in silver and shadow. The mountains were a dark line against a sky crowded with stars. The air smelled of new wheat and fresh-cut pine, and the particular sweetness that comes in California when the day's heat releases the scent of sage and wild rosemary. She looked down at her side, pushed the shawl aside. In the moonlight, the scar was visible, a thin silver ridge of healed skin running below her ribs. She touched it. No pain anymore. The nerve endings had sealed over, the flesh had knit, the wound had closed. But the scar remained. It would always remain. A record written on her body of the day. Everything changed. Footsteps behind her. The screen door opened softly. Hayes came out. He did not ask why she was awake. He never did. He simply stood beside her, close enough that their shoulders touched and looked out at the same sky. They stood there for a long time. The crickets sang. The wind moved through the wheat with a sound like breathing. "Do you think Billy Curtis would forgive you?" she asked. Hayes was quiet. The question hung in the air between them, weightless and heavy at the same time. "I do not know," he said finally. "But I have stopped needing the answer." Rebecca nodded. She understood. Forgiveness was not a destination. It was a direction. You walked toward it, and maybe you arrived and maybe you did not. But the walking itself was what mattered. The choice to keep moving forward instead of standing still. She took his hand. Gently, she placed it on the scar. His palm was warm against her skin. His fingers rested on the healed ridge of tissue, the mark his needle had made and his hands had mended, the place where the story of them began. His hand was still, no tremor. Not anymore. Neither of them spoke. The wind carried the smell of new wheat and fresh-cut pine. Somewhere in the house, Robert's old cat cried for milk. The mountains stood dark and patient against the sky. The way mountains do, ancient and unhurried, having seen all of this before and knowing they would see it again. Hayes thought, "This is the sound of a life I did not dare dream." He tightened his hand around hers. She tightened back. And they stood there on the porch of the house they would fill with children and laughter and the ordinary beautiful noise of a life shared. Two people who had been drifting, who had found each other in blood and dust and courage, who had chosen to stay while the wide western night, vast and silent and full of stars, folded around them like a promise kept. This content was carefully researched, developed, and manually edited by our team to deliver meaningful stories with valuable life lessons. Every narrative is crafted to entertain, inspire, and empower our audience. We believe that great stories can change lives, and we are committed to bringing you content that matters. Thank you for being part of our community.